Good morning and welcome to Coffee with Mr. V. And today we're going to move on from doing perfect competition and monopoly, and we're going to go on to oligopoly. In order to participate with Mr. V, you need to go and grab yourself a cup of coffee, excuse me, or any other liquid that takes your fancy. Grab yourself a cup, a glass or mug, whatever you fancy, fill it up with your favorite liquid. And then with me, we're going to do the synchronized sip. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. I love coffee. So, oligopoly. I'll be honest, this is probably one of those videos that if this is the first time you're looking at oligopoly, perhaps you need to wait, or you might want to study it first in a textbook, because I'm going to assume a little bit of knowledge. If you go into the specs, both at the IB or the A level, you'll see that oligopoly takes up a massive big chunk like that compared to the other market structures. I am going to attempt to do it all today, but in order to do that today, I'm going to have to assume that you are probably not seeing this for the first time. So over to the market structures spectrum, monopoly on the right-hand side, left-hand side, perfect competition over there on the right-hand side. And what I said in my last episode is that monopoly can isn't just this uber extreme over here, but it can operate at kind of anything between this extreme and somewhere beyond here. Oligopoly is kind of one step in from monopoly, but this is not a perfect science. So there is no exact cutoff of where a monopoly ends and an oligopoly begins. And hence why I've drawn these two kind of lozenges, just to make that point, and a kind of a gray area over here of like, who knows, is this a monopoly market structure or is this an oligopoly market structure? It could be that if you're given some data about a particular market structure, you could identify it as being a monopoly and another student might identify it as being an oligopoly, and you would both be right. Okay, and we'll talk about why that might be now. So characteristics of market structures. Okay, I always use the same for HIB. Okay, in terms of firms, we've got a handful of firms. And again, there's no hard and fast rule with that. Is it 3? Is it 5? Is it half a dozen? Who knows? What we're saying is a handful, all right? So probably half a dozen is the maximum, all of whom have, significant market power. So there's a series, there's a small cohort of dominant firms in the market. They have differentiated products, okay? So they're not homogenous and they're not the unique product that would only exist in monopoly. Imperfect information, and they have high barriers to entry. Again, differentiating itself from perfect competition over here, where there are no barriers to entry, and quite close to the monopoly side of things, high barriers to entry. So this is what we are dealing with. Now, there is a way of using what's called a concentration ratio. I might leave that for another video. I don't need to go into it here. You can have a look at it in a textbook. It's very easy. Essentially, you are calculating the market share of the 2, 3, 4 largest firms in a particular market. And if you get over a certain threshold, normally about 60 or 70%, then you could call that an oligopoly. So I'll just say that again to recap. If a handful of firms, and we are talking 3 to 6 firms in the market, have 60 to 70% of the market share between them, we can call this an oligopoly. Good example of oligopoly might be the groceries market in the UK. So Tesco's, Sainsbury's, okay, there's a big oligopoly there. We could also talk about mobile phones, both in terms of the manufacturers, Apple, Samsung, Huawei, LG. There's not really many others. Perhaps Nokia falls into it, but I don't think so. And also mobile network providers, EE, Vodafone. I lose count of who the other ones are. 3, or is that EE? Who knows anymore? Okay, again, there's only a handful of firms that are really dominant in the market there. Okay, so what does the market look like? Well, for any given firm, and we can call this Vodafone if we want, okay, Vodafone's demand curve would be downward sloping. It would be relatively inelastic, although perhaps not quite as inelastic as a perfect monopoly over there. Remember, that's our AR curve. And then we can just go from there and use all the tools that we've been building over the previous few episodes. So the MR curve is twice the gradient. Again, I haven't drawn that perfectly. As examiner might pick me up on that because it's not exactly halfway between the intersection there. Okay, I'm not going to worry about it today. a hockey stick or Nike swoosh shaped marginal cost curve, put in the profit maximizing level of output, read up to the demand curve and across to P1. That's our revenue. Then we can do a smiley face, a C curve with the minimum point intersecting with MC. That allows us then to read up to the average cost, and we can now look at our supernormal profit. So it is fair to say that firms in the oligopoly market structure will be making supernormal profit, as shown by that rectangle with the 4 dotted areas. So what happens in the long run then? Because we know that in perfect competition, if there is supernormal profit in the market, there are low barriers to entry, new firms will enter the market and squeeze that supernormal profit out. Well, in the oligopoly, a bit like the monopoly, we have high barriers to entry. Okay, might be high sunk costs, might be brand loyalty, might be something else, might be a licensing agreement with the government that's stopping other firms entering. And therefore, nothing changes in the long run. So what you should remember from episode before this, episode 11, is that actually this is the same diagram. The oligopoly diagram is the same as the monopoly diagram. Okay, they're making supernormal profit in the short run, and they are making supernormal profit in the long run. No change there. And therefore, we could talk about all the efficiencies very quickly. Allocatively efficient, AR equals MC is here, so not at Q1. So we are not allocatively efficient. Productive efficiency is at the minimum point of the AC curve, where MC equals AC, which is here. Again, that's not at Q1, so we are not productively efficient. Dynamic efficiency. Remember, dynamic efficiency needs 2 characteristics to be answered. Are we making supernormal profit? Yes. Do we have the incentive to reinvest that supernormal profit into research and development? I would argue in the case of the oligopoly, that actually there is a very large incentive to do that. You have a couple, or maybe 3 or 4, very close rivals in your industry, and therefore you will probably want to get some sort of competitive advantage on them. So therefore you are much more likely to invest it in R&D. So I think actually we probably are going to be quite dynamically efficient here. In terms of X efficiency then, remember X efficiency for me is being defined as there are no costs that the firm spends that are unrelated to the production process, or put a different way, to be X inefficient, the firm is spending on things that are superfluous, like tropical fish tanks. Okay, that's always my example. In the case of oligopoly, I think probably that they are in the same boat as monopolies, in the sense that they don't have to be particularly worried about being X efficient, because as we'll see in a moment, they're probably not going to be competing on price anyway. So they can, and they might be likely to, have those tropical fish tanks in the lobbies or the very fast company cars. So I'm going to say that they're likely to be not particularly X inefficient. Wrong, X efficient. They are likely to be X inefficient. So we can see oligopolies, again, a little bit like monopolies, are actually not great from an efficiency point of view. It's just from the dynamic efficiency, they are better than monopolies. Monopolies, remember, are probably not very dynamically efficient because they have no competitors. There is no reason to go out and spend the profit on R&D, because actually they're much more likely to just give it to shareholders. Now, let's come back to that thing that I just mentioned there. Firms in oligopolies, how do they compete? Because remember, the whole point about studying theory of the firm is to study the behavior of firms. What output are they going to set? What prices are they going to set? What decisions do they make with regards to the profit? So I want to consider for a moment that idea of how are they competing? And it's a big deal both in the A level and the IB. There are 2 ways that you can think about this. Okay, one is by using a game theory matrix, okay, which I've already drawn out for us here. Okay, one is game theory. And again, apologies if this is the first time that you're coming up against oligopoly. This might be This might work better if you've studied it in class first, okay? But to just kind of whistle through it very quickly, you need to imagine the firms, and again, we can think of this as Vodafone, and we can think of this as EE. So they're both in the same market, they both have quite a lot of dominant power, and we're going to assume then that they compete on prices. Vodafone has a choice of having high prices, low prices. EE has a choice of high prices and low prices, and the numbers in the middle represent the likely profit that both firms will make given those different pricing decisions. It's always useful to remember that the firm on the right-hand side, so playing this way, is the number at the beginning, okay? And the firm that's playing down is always the second player, firm B, and their number is always on the right-hand side of the two. So what do these numbers represent? They are meant to represent the amount of profit the firm will make given the pricing decisions that we're given here. And here I'm, so for example, if both firms set high prices, then what I'm saying is that they're going to both make 50 million and 50 million. On the other hand, if they both set low prices, they'll both make 20 million. And that's because neither of them are going to get a competitive edge. Neither of them have undercut their competitor. So they've both still got an equal market share, but because they're lower prices, they make less revenue. Hopefully that makes sense. What is interesting then are these two quadrants here. What they say is something slightly different, which is if firm A goes low, if Vodafone lowers its price, but EE doesn't and plays high, then what's going to happen is that all the consumers will move to Vodafone, and that will leave EE with relatively few. Some might stay through some sense of brand loyalty, but most people will change over. As a result, Vodafone will gain hugely in market share and profit and make 80 million, whereas EE will forego profit and only make 5. And those numbers are reversed when we play the opposite way around. EE lowers its price, but Vodafone does not. Okay, the numbers are reversed. So what does game theory say? Well, game theory says that both firms will act rationally. They will only do what's in their best interest. So, for example, if we know that EE is going to stay high, what should firm A do? Well, it could go high and make 50, or it could play low and make 80. It's going to go low. If we know that EE is going low, what should firm A do? Well, it could play high and make 5, or it could play low and make 20. It's going to go low. So we always know that Vodafone is going to lower its price. Since the numbers are the same for both firms, we actually know that firm B is also going to play low. This is what's known as their dominant strategies. So if both firms play their dominant strategies, we end up here, okay, at 2020. This is what's known as a Nash equilibrium. Neither firm can better their position by making a different choice. So for example, if firm A did decide suddenly to go high, it would reduce its profit from 20 to 5. Similarly for B, if B suddenly decided to go high, it would reduce its profit. So this is a Nash equilibrium. But this is rubbish, okay? This is a rubbish place to be. We're only making 20 million each, whereas we all know we could make 50-50. We could make 50 million each. And so what economics says is that in this market structure of oligopoly, what oligopolies almost super rationally, in a sense, will want to do is to try and move back up to that quadrant over here, okay? Because nobody likes a price war, okay? If we have a price war, we all lose money, and that's no good. We want to move us back up here, and that can only really happen with collusion. So economics, or theory of the firm, predicts that in oligopolies there will be collusion between firms. Sometimes this will be overt collusion, as in the way you need to think about this is all the firms sat around a table and actually negotiating and saying, we're going to fix prices at a particular level, aren't we? Or it may be tacit. That's slightly more difficult to get your head around. Instead of sitting around a table, we're kind of just like winking and nodding at each other across the table. Sometimes it might be called price leadership. I'm going to post up my prices first. I'm going to watch you guys very carefully to see what you do. But we've all got a kind of innate understanding that actually price wars are bad for all of us. So we'll keep our prices high. So economics predicts that oligopolies will always end up with collusion, with some sense of collusion, or at least not competing on price. I did say that there were two ways of doing it. The other way of doing this is through something called the kinked demand curve. People often think that this is the oligopoly diagram. I guess it is a diagram and it's relevant to oligopolies, but the oligopoly diagram is this one, the one that we drew earlier. Don't ever make that mistake. If you need to draw an oligopoly diagram, draw that one. If, on the other hand, you need to draw a diagram that proves that oligopolies, or firms in an oligopolistic market rather, are likely to lead to collusive practices, then the kink demand curve is the one that you're after. And again, I will talk through this relatively quickly. It's the sort of thing that if you haven't studied it before, you might want to wait till it comes up in a lesson before we go any further. Right, Vodafone currently sets a price of P1 and it has Q1 number of customers. If Vodafone decides to raise its price to P2, and you can see here it's a relatively small change because there are a handful of firms in the market, okay, but with big dominant power, and it's a slightly differentiated product, it's an oligopoly. The theory says that what we're likely to see is a big fall in market share. This is because EE is not going to raise its prices as well. Why would it? Yeah, think about the game theory. If Vodafone stays high, then the best thing that EE can do is go low. Okay. If Vodafone chooses to raise its prices, EE is not going to follow it. EE is going to keep its prices at the same level. Everybody is going to suddenly flock to EE, and the market share for Vodafone will be greatly reduced. And what I want you to recognize here is that even though the price went up by only a bit, the market share fell by a lot. And that is the literal definition of price elastic demand. So we can draw a relatively shallow demand curve there, okay? However, if Vodafone reduces its price, okay, from P1 to P3, and I've made this quite a large percentage change in the price now, what do we expect will happen? Well, looking at kind of the game theory and thinking about how we know oligopolies are likely to work, we would expect that EE now is going to reduce their prices along with Vodafone as well. Because if you have just a few competitors and one of them reduces their prices, well, if you don't reduce your price, you're going to be the one losing your market share. So you will join them by reducing prices. But if everybody reduces their prices, then that doesn't change consumer behavior. I'm going to stick with Vodafone, or I'll stick with EE. There's no point switching. I don't have anything to gain by switching. So if Vodafone does gain any potential customers, it will only gain a few, and it's only likely to be, you know, customers who weren't willing or able to have a mobile phone contract before that now are. Big fall in price, only a relatively small gain in sales. And again, that is the literal definition of being price inelastic in demand. And this is why it's called the kink demand curve, because as you can see, it's not just perfectly straight, it's actually elastic to begin with, and it is inelastic down here, and there's the kink in the middle. Now, I could go into much greater depth with this, but neither the A-level nor the IB really needs me to. If you want me to start looking at marginal revenue curves with you and marginal cost curves, we can, but I don't think we need to get the basic idea. This is our demand curve. This is our AR curve. What do we know about price elastic goods? Well, we know that we should reduce prices in order to maximize revenue. When you have inelastic goods, you should always increase the price to increase revenue. Where does this lead us to? It leads us to this point here. This is the point of maximizing revenue. This is our maximizing revenue point. I'll say that again. At the elastic point, we learned last year in year one that if you have an elastic good, you should always reduce the price. That increases revenue. Similarly, we learned that if you have an inelastic good, think of heroin, for example, and drug dealers, they should always put their prices up because people will keep buying and therefore you increase your revenue. So if you're increasing prices here and decreasing prices there, you're going to maximize your revenue here. This is a revenue maximizing point. And whatever you do, whether you increase prices above or decrease price below, you're going to lose revenue. Okay, so firms won't. What's the conclusion from this then? Well, I'm not going to change my price. I'm going to keep my price at P1. I have nothing to gain from increasing my price or decreasing my price. Price stability. Okay, we are not going to compete on prices. I have nothing to gain. So whether you look at the analysis through game theory or you look at the analysis through the kink demand curve, the conclusion that the theory of the firm brings us to is always the same. Firms in oligopolistic markets do not compete on price. So I hear you ask, how do they compete? Well, on everything other than price. And if you were doing business studies, you might well talk about the 4 Ps, okay? The marketing mix. You would talk about price. You would talk about promotion, you would talk about product, and you would talk about place. If you're doing A-level business, you may even talk about the 7 Ps as well. Well, we're taking price off the table because we're not competing on price. That's what we've concluded from our theory of the firm. So probably then, firms in oligopolistic markets are going to compete on these 3 things. Promotion, think about things like advertising, think about sports sponsorships, think about things like celebrity endorsements. How are you promoting your product? Product then is exactly what you think it is, product differentiation. So if it's a manufactured product, you know, what colorways does it come in? Is there a slimline version? Is there a kind of more male-friendly, female-friendly version? Is there a version that is kind of differentiated in terms of niche markets that it's looking for? Place, it used to be a place that was all about the physical location. You know, where are you in the country? Are you in an urban or a rural area? I think in 2020, we need to think about more about the web presence, internet presence. What does your website look like? Is it intuitive or is it really hard and clunky and nobody wants to visit it or stay on it for very long? So these are the 3 main ways that firms in oligopolies will compete, because analysis tells us that they won't compete on price. Of course, in real life, the theory doesn't always add up. And sometimes price wars do happen with oligopolies. And if you look there in the spec, particularly on the Edexcel spec, they give you some examples of why that might happen. Predatory pricing, I want to get rid of an incumbent firm from my market. Limit pricing, I want to stop a new entrant from entering the market, or indeed it might be some sort of different business strategy. So maybe I'm going for sales maximization, or I'm going for revenue maximization, or I'm going for something else, in which case my price might actually fall, enable for me to achieve that. And that happens, you know, in real life. Supermarkets have price wars. Sometimes mobile phone networks have price wars. It does happen, but it happens relatively rarely, and this is why. Okay, we don't have any time for answering any of your questions today, but I will try and get round to that in my next lesson. Okay, good to have you along, and I will see you with the next episode. Cheerio.